The Sioux are one of the largest and oldest Native American tribes in North America, dating back 2,000 or 3,000 years, with a territory that spanned thousands of square miles. At the peak of their strength, the Sioux are one of the most well-known and influential tribes in the history of the United States. Origins. The ancestral Sioux most likely lived in the central Mississippi Valley region and later in Minnesota shortly before 800 A. D. The Sioux arrived in the northwoods of central Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin from the central Mississippi River. Around 13 AD, they adopted the characteristics of a northern tribal society and became known as the Seven Council Fires. Within the Seven Council Fires were 7 bands. These are the original bands. They are based on kinship, dialect, and geographic proximity. There are now various groups who descend from the original 7 and maintain autonomy over the governing of their tribe. The 3 largest subsets of the Sioux Nation are the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. Keep in mind that some historians believe the Nakota were part of the Dakota. These are also the 3 main languages spoken among the Sioux and any of the dialects. Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota translates to friend or ally, referring to the alliances between the bands. Like other native tribes, the Sioux believe animals are relatives. They feel a special bond among all living things, plants, animals, spirits, and people. It is believed that the Great Spirit created the universe and embodies everything in the universe as one. Their primary cultural prophet is the white buffalo calf woman, who came as an intermediary between the Great Spirit and humankind to teach them how to be good relatives by introducing the 7 sacred rites and the sacred pipe. The 7 ceremonies are the Purification Lodge, Crying for Vision the Sun Dance, Making of Relatives the Female Puberty Ceremony, Throwing of the Ball, and Soul Keeping. The Sioux Way of Life. Before the 1600s, the Dakota lived in the area around Lake Superior, where they hunted wild rice and other foods, hunted deer and buffalo, and speared fish from canoes. But during the 1700s, warfare with the Ojibwe tribe to their east drove the Dakota into what is now southern and western Minnesota, at that time the territory of the agricultural Lakota and Nakota. After that, the Lakota and Nakota moved to what are now states of North and South Dakota. As horses were becoming common on the plains during this period, the Lakota and Nakota abandoned agriculture in favor of a lifestyle centered on the nomadic hunting of buffalo. Traditionally, the Lakota and Nakota shared many cultural characteristics with other nomadic plains native societies. They lived in teepees, wore clothing made from leather, suede or fur, and traded buffalo products for corn produced by the farming tribes of the plains. The Sioux also raided those tribes frequently, particularly the Mandan, Arikara, Hidatsa, and Pawnee, actions that eventually drove these tribes to ally themselves with the U.S. military against the Sioux. Later Sioux culture in the past. The Sioux lived in camps of larger and extended families that are connected with a sense of community. An appointed leader would create a deep understanding of identity and belonging for the camp. Life in these communities centered around daily subsistence tasks divided by age and gender. Hunting, warfare, and making tools and weapons were the responsibilities of men, with time left over for trading councils, ceremonies, and leisure activities such as horse races. Women's responsibilities, including gathering wild resources such as prairie turnips, processing and tanning hides, cooking, sewing, quill work, and managing the daily needs of the household. Women were responsible for breaking camp, packing belongings on travois, and setting up camp again at the end of the day. Older children and youth frequently had responsibility for gathering firewood and water and tending to horses and dogs. Grandparents and elders were often entrusted with the primary responsibility of caring for small children and infants and assisting with household tasks. In Lakota society, men were allowed to have more than one wife, and men of high status frequently had several wives. First, contacts with settlers and relations with the Ojibwe. In the 1600s, the Dakotas traded with French merchants, as also other tribes did at the time. The French were trying to gain advantage in the struggle for the North American for trade against the English. The Ojibwe Potawatomi and Ottawa bands were among the first to trade with the French. The first recorded encounter between the Sioux and the French occurred when explorers Radisson and Groseilliers reached what is now Wisconsin. During the winter of 1659 to 1660, the relationship between the Sioux and the Ojibwe was a complicated one. In 1679, the Sioux and the Ojibwe formed an alliance through peaceful diplomacy at Fond du Lac in present-day Minnesota. The Ojibwe agreed to provide the Sioux with fur, trade goods, and in return, the Sioux permitted the Ojibwe to move west toward the Mississippi River. During this period of peace that lasted for 57 years, the Ojibwe and Sioux often hunted together, created families together, shared their religious experiences, and prospered. Over time, the Dakota began to resent the Ojibwe, trading with their hereditary enemies, the Cree and the Seneca, with whom they were at war. The French also added to the fallout by playing both sides. Tensions rose in the 1720s and spilled into a war in 1736. The Sioux no longer needed the Ojibwe to supply them with trade goods. They began to resent the Ojibwe presence in their lands. The Ojibwe, having lived there for almost 3 generations, were not about to leave. They decided to fight for the territory they had originally entered in. As guests, the Sioux-Ojibwe War that started in 1736 was to evolve into one of the most long-lasting wars in North American history. It soon stretched along a standing front from central Wisconsin through Minnesota to the Red River of the North. By blocking all travel and trade across this line, the war had a major effect on the fur trade. It redirected traders to safer, more northern routes, much to the satisfaction of the Cree and Ojibwe. It blocked off European access to the Sioux market. Soon the Ojibwe spread out to occupy the waterways from Grand Portage to Rainy Lake, with their main town at the latter spot. From there they started pushing south toward the Sioux settlements at Leech, Red, and Sandy Lakes before 40 years were up. All of northern Minnesota would be theirs. One of the larger battles between the Sioux and Ojibwe took place in 1770, fought at the Dalles of the St. Croix. According to William Whipple Warren, a Métis historian, the fighting began when the Mesquite tribe engaged the Ojibwe, their hereditary enemies around St. Croix Falls. The Dakota were the former enemies of the Mesquite, but were enlisted to make a joint attack against the Ojibwe. The Mesquite were first to engage. With the large Ojibwe war party, the Mesquite allegedly boasted to the Dakota to hold back, as they would make short work of their enemies. When the Sioux joined the battle, they had the upper hand until Ojibwe reinforcements arrived. While the Sioux and Ojibwe suffered heavy losses, the Mesquite were left with the most dead. The Ojibwe emerged victorious and secured control of the upper St. Croix. That created an informal boundary between the Sioux and Ojibwe around the mouth of the Snake River. The Dakotas lost the traditional lands around Leech Lake and Mill Lake as they were forced south along the Mississippi River and St. Croix River Valley as a result of the battles. As the Lakota and Nakota moved west and entered the prairies, they adopted many of the customs of the neighboring plains tribes, creating new cultural patterns based on the horse and fur trade. Meanwhile, the Dakota Sioux retained many of their woodlands features. By 1803, the 3 divisions of the Sioux, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, were established in their different environments and had developed their own distinctive life ways. However, due to the same cultural aspects, the 3 divisions maintained strong ties. Life and war in the West. Having suffered from the encroachment of the Ojibwe, the Sioux were extremely resistant to incursions upon their new territory. This territory was increasingly broached as the colonial frontier moved westward past the Mississippi River in the mid-19th century. The California gold rush of 1849 opened a floodgate of travelers, and many Sioux became cautious by the U.S. government's attempt to establish the Bozeman Trail and other routes through the tribe's sovereign lands. In 1851, the signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty happened. This treaty allowed safe passage for settlers along the Oregon Trail. It was an unfortunate incident that broke the peace. A cow escaped from a Mormon party in 1854, and it wandered into a Sioux camp. The Mormons searched for it and became afraid upon seeing the natives. They returned to their own camp and reported the incident to the army at Fort Laramie, telling the soldiers the cow had been stolen. Lieutenant John Grattan led a force into the village and tried to arrest the man whom he insisted had killed the cow. When the man claimed innocence, Grattan ordered cannons to be fired. Chief Conquering Bear, spokesman for the Sioux, was killed. The Sioux launched a counterattack and killed the entire detachment. In retaliation, in September of 1855, General William S. Harney took 600 troops and overran a Sioux village at Blue Water, killing 85 people and taking 70 women and children captives. In the east, the Sioux were overwhelmed with settlers, constantly wanting more of their land. In August of 1860, the Sioux started to raid on settlements and trading posts. Little Crow, chief of the band, led several assaults on Fort Ridgely. The troops inside the fort fired howitzers, killing as many as 100 warriors. The Sioux continued to raid, drawing the attention of General Henry H. Sibley, who arrived at Fort Ridgely with 15 troops. Little Crow led more successful raids, but finally the army moved against the Sioux, and at Wood Lake, the warriors were no match for the artillery. Many of the scattered Sioux escaped and fled to the Dakota Territory, or further on to Canada. Those who stayed were ordered hanged by President Abraham Lincoln on December 26, 1860, at Nakota, Minnesota. The largest mass execution in American history took place. 38 members of the Dakotas were hanged. After the Civil War, a new trail discovered by John Bozeman brought more miners and settlers to Montana. The trail shortened the trip from the east, but crossed through the heart of the hunting grounds of the Cheyenne and Sioux. Soon the Sioux joined the Northern Cheyenne and Northern Arapaho to raid settlers and military patrols along the trail. In 1866, Red Cloud and other chiefs met with Army officers at Fort Laramie to discuss the new trail. While some of the chiefs signed a non-aggression treaty, Red Cloud left to prepare for war. The Army sought to reinforce Fort Reno and to add to new forts Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith to the Bozeman Trail route. The same year, Crazy Horse managed to deceive some soldiers sent out to find wood. The soldiers thought the Sioux were going one direction, and when they tried to avoid the party of warriors, they were led directly into an ambush. A relief party led by Captain William Fetterman fell into another trap, and the entire 80-man party was killed. More soldiers were sent, this time with breech-loading rifles, a new type of weapon that was much easier and faster to load. While the warriors chased both parties back into their forts, both suffered many casualties. Finally, with the Transcontinental Railroad south of the Platte River near completion, the government gave up. The signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 granted Red Cloud's demand for abandoning the Bozeman forts in exchange for stopping the raids. Once abandoned, the Sioux burned down the forts. With the arrival of the railroad, the source of the Plains natives' lifestyle, the buffalo, was disappearing. Not only was the new railroad frightening these once numerous animals, the soldiers and settlers were hunting them by the thousands additionally. By the 1870s, both sides had violated the Fort Laramie Treaty. There was also talking of a new railroad line, called the Northern Pacific, that attracted new settlers in the area. However, it was the discovery of gold in 1874 in the Sioux Sacred Black Hills that would be the event to cause the next round of fighting. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led the native warriors. General William T. Sherman and General Philip H. Sheridan led Army troops war broke out when the military ordered native hunting bands to come into the reservations or be declared hostiles. The native warriors won a battle at Montana's Powder River in March of 1876 with heavy Army casualties. Then in the late spring, a three-pronged campaign was starting, with General George Crook coming from the south, Colonel John Gibbon coming from the west, and General Alfred Terry with Colonel George A. Custer advancing from the east. On June 17, 1876, Crazy Horse, with 700 Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, moved against the 1,000-man force of General Crook. The Native warriors, well organized, repeated attacks drove Crook's men back to their base, with numerous casualties. The Sioux and Cheyenne now regrouped on a meadow called Greasy Grass. Along the Little Bighorn River, the total encampment contained 7,000 natives, with approximately 18 of them warriors. On June 21, St. Terry's and Gibbons columns united. Major Marcus Reno's scouting party reported the general location of the native camp, and Terry sent Custer's 7th Cavalry to cut them off, while the rest of the troops approached from the north. When Custer's scouts discovered the encampment, instead of waiting for the rest of the army, Custer organized for an immediate attack. His plan proved disastrous, and on June 25, Custer's entire force of approximately 200 men was wiped out. This would be the last major victory for the warriors, led by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Chief Gall. The next 6 months would show to be disastrous for the natives. Both Sioux and Cheyenne would lose a number of battles, and many soldiers as a result of that. Sitting Bull and his band fled to Canada. Crazy Horse surrendered in 1877, only to be killed while resisting orders. For his imprisonment, Sitting Bull returned in 1881 and surrendered at Fort Buford. He was moved to the Standing Rock Agency and was killed in 1890 while resisting arrest. The final chapter of the wars would be played out in 1890. Vovoka, a Paiute mystic, started the ghost dance movement. He preached that the ghost dance would bring the old world back, the dead would come alive, the buffalo would return, and all whites would be removed from the plains. In order to make the event happen, Native American warriors should dance the ghost dance. To the poor, defeated, and disappointed people, most living on reservations, the new religion gave them hope. It was also thought that the ghost dance shirts would protect the wearer from white men's bullets. In November of 1890, the U.S. government banned the ghost dance. On the Sioux reservations, Indian police were ordered to arrest Sitting Bull, a staunch supporter of the ghost dance. In the scuffle that ensued, Sitting Bull and 6 of his warriors were killed. Bigfoot was also to be arrested, but before soldiers arrived, he and his followers set out for the Pine Ridge Agency. General Nelson Miles, now in charge of the Division of the Missouri, sent the 7th Cavalry under Major S.M. Whitside to intercept the band of Sioux. When the cavalry finally found the tribe, the soldiers ordered them to camp for the night at Wounded Knee Creek on the morning of December 29th. While Bigfoot and other leaders were meeting with the Army officers, a rifle accidentally discharged. Colonel James Forsyth, who had arrived to take charge, ordered the troops to shoot. Artillery was used to cut down those men, women, and children trying to flee the carnage. More than 250 people, including Bigfoot, had been killed. This ended the almost 40-year battle by the Sioux to retain their lands and way of life. 20th and 21st centuries, after the hostilities ended, the government forced tribes into sending their children to boarding schools. Boarding schools were intended to, quote, kill the Indian to save the man, which meant the destruction of native societies. Children were taken away from their families. They were dressed in American clothing, given English names, had their hair cut, and were forbidden to speak their languages. Their religions and ceremonies were also outlawed and forbidden. The goal was to teach academic studies in English, vocational skills suited to American society, such as farming, in order to replace traditional lifestyles. These schools were overcrowded and had poor sanitary conditions, which led to infectious diseases and students running away or dying at those schools. In 1930, for the Indian Reorganization Act sought to overturn many of the policies of the past by reversing the traditional goal of cultural assimilation of the tribes into American society. It ended land allotment, prohibited non-consensual land seizure, recognized tribal governments, encouraged the writing of tribal constitutions, and empowered Native people to manage their own resources. Between 1934 and 1945, the tribes would vote on their government constitutions, although some tribes refused or used their older constitutions. In the 20th century, the government passed few acts that both helped and harmed Native communities. As the civil rights movement peaked, Native Americans founded the American Indian movement. Conflicting political values would create long-lasting tensions on the reservations. The accusations of corruption by tribal leaders would lead to the Wounded Knee Siege, which began on February 27, 1973, when the town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, was seized by followers of the American Indian movement. The occupiers controlled the town for 71 days, while various state and federal law enforcement agencies, such as the FBI and the United States Marshal Service, laid siege. Natives protested what they said was the local, corrupt government along with federal issues affecting Native reservation communities. Native Americans from many other communities, primarily urban areas, mobilized to come and join the occupation. The siege lasted for 71 days. 12 people were wounded, including an FBI agent left paralyzed. 2 people died and 2 went missing. After the Wounded Knee incident, the Sioux would continue their push for tribal rights and self-determination. As for the Black Hills occupation, the Indian Claims Commission, the U.S. Congress and the Supreme Court heard the case in 1980 and ruled that the federal government had illegally taken the Black Hills and awarded more than $100 million in reparations to the tribe, stating that the land was never for sale. The Sioux refused to accept the money, which is now over $1 billion. Early 21st century population estimates indicated some 170,000 individuals of Sioux descent.